Good evening from Singapore. I am Lauren Sorkin, the Executive Director of the Resilient Cities Network, and I am so pleased to welcome everyone here today to Cities on the Frontline. Cities on the Frontline is a virtual thought leadership speaker series. This series began in 2020, co-organized by our team at the Resilient Cities Network and our colleagues in the World Bank Group's Cities Resilience Program. This speaker series provides city practitioners and the industries and residents they support an understanding of what it means to live in a peri-pandemic time with the associated stresses and continuing to plan and invest in solutions. And today's topic will focus on exactly that issue. In a complex time, how can we continue aligning stakeholder priorities in urban resilience? But before we begin, let me share the ground rules for Cities on the Frontline. I want to first remind everyone that the intention of this speaker series is to have an honest and open learning conversation. These calls are not on the record, and we ask that you do not attribute any of the comments unless you have the person's express permission to do so. And we can help you get that permission if you need it. We have more than 600 registered participants for the call today. So to facilitate the discussion, we ask that you pose your questions in the Q&A function of the WebEx. Please note that the recording of the session, as well as the PowerPoint presentations, will be posted online by next Monday. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Sameh Waba from the World Bank to open with me. Sameh, over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone connected from around the world. And thanks, Lauren, for kicking off the session. My name is Sameh. I'm the Global Director for Urban Disaster Risk Management, Resilience and Land at the World Bank. And it's my pleasure to take part in this first episode of our Cities in the Frontline speaker series for 2022. I would like to take the opportunity to congratulate the Resilient Cities Network team for initiating this joint series with the World Bank, over 2 years ago and managing it so successfully. Now, before handing it over to our panelists, I would like to use the opportunity to highlight 2 points that I believe will be pertinent for this conversation. The first is the continued importance of urban resilience in the global development agenda. So our global practice at the World Bank, urban resilience, and like many other development partners, works to support cities in their transition towards low carbon and climate resilient pathways. We know that globally, in accordance with the State of the City Climate Finance Report, there is an estimated $384 billion in climate financing that flows into cities. But at the same time, we're talking about trillions of investment needs. So we're pretty short of where we need to be. So one of the key challenges for cities as they are trying to achieve their climate goals is the availability for financing and for technical assistance. That's why in 2017, my global practice at the World Bank, and with the support of the Swiss Secretariat of Economic Affairs, SECO, of which Dagmar is leading the team and with us here today, and with the support of the Austrian Ministry of Finance. So I take the opportunity to thank them for the great support and collaboration. We have established a program called the City Resilience Program, CRP, as part of the Global Facility for Disaster Reduction and Recovery, GFDRR. And what CRP aims is to increase financing, both public and private, for cities and to help them in finding the tools and the technical assistance they need to tackle their climate challenges. And CRP is one of the elements in the arsenal of the Making Cities Resilient campaign of the 2030 launched by UNDRR. And to this date, the program has engaged with 140 cities or more around the world to develop investment programs that could be funded with a range of financial instruments. So through the World Bank teams, the cities call on the CRP to assist them in assessing their vulnerabilities, plan for increasing resilience, and finding innovative ways to finance resilient infrastructure. Now, the second point I wanted to make is, of course, the prolonged impact of the COVID-19 crisis, which is affecting our lives, our work. Now, the pandemic has pushed over 100 million people into extreme poverty. And in fact, this is the first setback in poverty alleviation in over 2 decades. And it's deepening existing sources of fragility and instability. We're talking about impacts on long-term productivity. We're talking about losses in learning adjusted school years and prolonged spells of unemployment. And cities have borne much of this impact. So one lesson that comes out of it that's clear for all of us is the need for long-term planning and for general resilience thinking and building. So the recent experience has showed us that the critical resilience of urban resilience initiatives, the critical importance of urban resilience initiatives to work alongside the efforts to alleviate the pandemic and its impact and to contribute to long-term recovery. So with that said, let me hand it back over to Lauren so that she can launch the event with our first guest speaker. Lauren, please.
Thank you so much, Sameh. Our first speaker tonight needs almost no introduction to an urban resilience crowd, but it's really my pleasure to welcome a friend and colleague, Ms. Mami Mizutori, who is the special representative to the UN Secretary General for Disaster Risk Reduction. And she is concurrently the head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is based, for those who don't know, in Geneva, Switzerland. She has been in this role since March of 2018. Before this, she served in many capacities in the Japanese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and before that was the executive director of the Sainsbury Institute for the Study of Japanese Arts and Culture at the University of East Anglia. Mami, it's such a pleasure to have you here with us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren. Hello, Sameh. Good afternoon from Geneva all. So Sameh and Lauren, my good friends and partners, know that I'm the last kind of person who starts a presentation by quoting a Roman philosopher, but I'm going to try today because a colleague at UNDRR shared with me a quote that I think speaks volumes to the challenges that cities face today. It was Seneca the Younger who said, "An age builds up cities, an hour destroys them." Probably climate emergency was not the first order of business in those days, but what has not changed since then is the amount of energy, effort, time, innovation that goes into creating a sustainable city, as well as the lack of prevention and preparedness, which can result in loss and damages and the dysfunction of a city. What is different today compared to the time of Seneca is the frequency, intensity, and compounded nature of disasters that hit cities. We are living through this right now, as Sameh mentioned. Tonga, a case in point, slammed by Cyclone Haradin, April 2020, right after the pandemic started. Now an underwater volcano erupted. We don't know yet the full impact. But meanwhile, response efforts are proving to be difficult because, as an island nation so far successful in isolating themselves from the pandemic, they do not want to compromise their tight border control. And it's a very challenging situation, to say the least. But if there is a silver lining to this terrible pandemic at all, it is the strong realization that resilience needs to start local, from the cities at the front line. And of course, enhancing local resilience is already embedded in SDGs, SDG 11. And already from the year 2000, UNDRR, we ran a decade-long awareness-raising campaign for local resilience, the Making Cities Resilient campaign, MCRC, which was successful in bringing together more than 4,000 cities. But now, in the era of climate emergency, pandemics, we need to support cities to understand better the risks they are surrounded by, to have a plan for urban resilience with clear priorities, and more than anything, support cities in scaling up investment in disaster and climate resilience. Now, obviously, this needs financing and technical cooperation. And when we did a survey towards the end of MCRC, cities made clear that their challenge was accessing finance and support for building their resilience, which is the theme of today's webinar. And I shared this with Sameh soon after we met in 2019 at the Global Platform in Geneva. I remember Sameh saying, well, actually, there is quite a lot of financing and technical support out there which is available. And this made me think that we need a successor of the MCRC, which is more powerful and useful for cities, which could be an initiative, a platform supporting cities throughout their resilience journey by bringing together all partners who can support cities directly or indirectly to access the financing and the technical support desperately needed. Now, luckily, there were many organizations and groups who agreed to come together for this, including GFDRR and the Resilient Cities Network, and this led to the creation of Making Cities Resilient 2030, now known as MCR 2030. It was launched last year by 10 core partners with expertise network in urban resilience and development, and we serve as the Secretariat at the global and regional level. Our goal is to support cities in identifying their vision for disaster resilience, and the importance is that we were all trying to do the same thing. We all try to do the same thing now, urban resilience, but bringing us all together, it creates a real platform which can provide a collective initiative to cities. MCR 2030 was recently strengthened with UNDP joining, and cities of all sizes can join. Peer learning support is an important feature, and cities which have already reached a high level of resilience and which are committed to supporting other cities are designated as resilient hubs. List of resilient hubs is growing. Dubai, Barcelona, Greater Manchester, Milan, and Helsingborg on it. And we have a pipeline in which cities from Global South are also aspiring to become a hub. We're also bringing together service providers into the initiative. We have an online dashboard which provides a marketplace for member cities so that they can access these service providers from the development sector, academia, private sector for knowledge, tools, and resources. Now, at the end of last year, we checked in with 125 local governments which are partaking in MCR 2030 to identify their needs. Two important findings relating to today's session came out. Firstly, once again, cities expressed need for more support in accessing finance for risk reduction projects and initiatives. Second, cities asked for support in developing and managing partnerships with the private sector. So UNDRR and our fellow MCR 2030 core partners, we will take note of this, and we will increase our support in these two areas. But they're not easy, so we need to bang our heads together and find out how we can do it. In conclusion, please allow me to emphasize that scaled up, effective international partnership, strengthening disaster and climate resilience, such as MCR 2030, adds immense value. They help cities protect hard-earned development gains, save lives and livelihoods, and keep people out of poverty. We want to encourage more and more cities to join, and we want more service providers to be part of this endeavor so that we can really achieve SDG 11 by 2030. Acting now gives us an opportunity to update the old quote that I mentioned at the beginning. An age builds up cities, but an hour cannot destroy them. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mami, for the excellent points you've raised, for the wisdom that you've brought, and also for UNDRR's leadership in moving forward the MC Making Cities Resilient 2030 campaign. Now, I would like to introduce our second panelist, Dagmar Vogel. Dagmar is the head of the Infrastructure Financing Division at the Swiss State Secretariat for Economic Affairs, SECO. She's been leading the team since May 2007, is responsible for the infrastructure program covering transition and developing countries. And she's one of the major champions of the City Resilience Program, having helped the World Bank conceive it. Previously, she was the deputy head of division and senior program manager for SECO infrastructure programs in Central Asia, Latin America, and Southeastern Europe. We're happy to have you here today with us, Dagmar. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Sameh, for the introductory words. Thank you to the team for having organized this panel, and thank you for the interest of the audience. Let me immediately come to the key questions which we have been asked. Now, the first one is, why do we support partner countries in emerging markets in strengthening urban resilience? Why does this matter to us? Well, first, we care about this topic because we have been experiencing that resilience really matters. On the pictures, you can see that Switzerland has been exposed for centuries to extreme weather events, combined with its topography with steep mountains, glaciers, and rivers. Given this natural exposure and given the increasing effects of climate change, Switzerland has developed a comprehensive system of risk analysis, early warning systems, risk mitigation, emergency response, and recovery measures. A good example for this is the historic flooding in 2005. Heavy rains led to massive disruptions in traffic and to damages running into billions. 7 people were killed. Thereafter, a comprehensive package of measures has been taken to prevent from similar losses and damages. The federal government, together with the cantons, which are the provinces, invested a total of 4.5 billion Swiss francs in flood protection and continue to do so annually with 380 million Swiss francs. These measures contain significant infrastructure investments and hydraulic engineering measures. But not only investments are important. The Hydraulic Engineering Act is currently being revised, forecast models are improved, and organizational structures adapted to allow Switzerland to react quicker and more efficiently in case of natural disasters. Investments and measures are considerable. But in any case, such ex ante resilience pays off. We know from experience in Switzerland and elsewhere that $1 invested in prevention saves between $4 to $10 of reconstruction costs. So our contribution is financed from Swiss official development assistance approved every 4 years by the Swiss government and the parliament. There are 4 general criteria which apply to this assistance. So there has to be a need of the population. There has to be a long-term interest of Switzerland, which is to contribute to sustainable development, and a stable global economic framework. And also there has to be a value added. Thus, the topic of urban resilience with a focus on climate resilience fully complies with these criteria. Why is that? So there is a need in our partner countries. The 2 megatrends in urbanization and climate change create significant challenges for the resilience and prosperity of cities and people. In order to grasp the huge economic opportunities of urbanization, exposed cities need to be aware of those risks and challenges in order to monitor and plan ahead and to make smart investment decisions. Second point is increasing urban resilience contributes to a stable economic framework and thus supports economic growth and prosperity. And finally, the last criteria, the value added, as mentioned in the beginning, disaster risk reduction and resilience is very much in our DNA. And therefore, we can share relevant experience and knowledge in this area. This is why strengthening urban resilience is a priority for us, with following key activity lines very briefly. So first, integration of resilience in smart and sustainable urban planning, an integrated approach. Second, preparation and support to disaster-proofed infrastructure. Third, we should ensure that public finances are robust towards the negative impacts of disasters. And fourth, we want to strengthen private sector participation to contribute to increased resilience. Now, let's move to the second question. What do we consider a success in terms of urban resilience support? We consider our interventions to be successful if they are, which is it's obvious, it's relevant, effective, and sustainable. What does that mean? In terms of relevance, that means that the supported activities have to address an explicit need of the partner cities and have to be adapted to the local context. That means they have to be based on an in-depth local analysis, and we want to really avoid blueprints. What about effectiveness? We need to account on the effectiveness to our government as ODAs financed with tax money. This is done through results frameworks and standard indicators to which all projects have to contribute. Urban resilience activities are effective if they achieve good results. For example, in awareness on relevance of climate change resilience in national and subnational governments, or respective adaptations in the legal and regulatory framework, risk-informed planning and decisions and monitoring, as well as access to DRR and climate financing for prioritized projects. And with respect to sustainability, our support is limited, as you know, to a period of a couple of years. After that program, the institutions should deliver results independently and in the long run. And now, as a last comment, we were asked, what do we expect from cities to achieve this success? So there are 4 basic indicators. One is a clear interest to better understand and overcome risks. Second, commitment in long-term urban planning. Third, a political support for measures that only pay off in the long run, but sustainably. And fourth, leadership and also financial commitment to manage the institutions and investments sustainably in the long term. Thank you.
So much, Dagmar, and thank you for emphasizing the importance not only of being responsive and really led by city need, but also the fact that it's required to make political commitment and long-term commitment to these resilience building goals, and then have that as a pathway to then attract the long-term investment, both from donor funders, but also very importantly from the private sector. So we're now bridging to the next part of our presentation to talk to our practitioners who are on the ground. And so it's my pleasure to now introduce Ms. Anthea Stevens, who's coming to us from South Africa, where she is the Climate and Sustainability Component Lead for the city's support program at the National Treasury of South Africa. And she has been throughout her career designing and delivering very innovative and collaborative solutions for resilience. And prior to this, she was working at the National Grasslands Program of South Africa as the director of the Biodiversity Institute, and prior to that, as the country director for IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature in South Africa. So Anthea, thank you for being here. I'm turning the screen and the microphone over to you.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone, and thanks for this opportunity. I want to acknowledge both colleagues in the World Bank that we're working with in South Africa through the City Support Program, as well as the support from SECO in some of the work that we're doing that I want to share with you. And I think the layering of this discussion builds quite nicely down to the ground, as it were, from some of the global finance and donor priorities into how do we get that alignment that this topic is very much pitched at. So as we all know, city and national governments are tasked with developing and implementing plans and raising finance to address development priorities of their citizens. Also aligning these plans and their implementation with international development obligations that countries have committed to. And for ministries of finance and national treasuries where I work, failing to integrate an understanding of risk and resilience into development is a massive risk that puts lives, livelihoods, and investments at risk. And for that reason, the National Treasury in South Africa wanted to do something about this and reached out to our partners, SECO and the World Bank, to support us in trying to tackle some of these challenges. We also know, and this is probably something that's quite familiar from many places around the world, that the development and implementation of plans is often done through the functions responsible for the services. So getting alignment of plans, of priorities, particularly in terms of bigger transformation objectives like resilience, sustainability, and getting these priorities integrated into strategic and sectoral plans, and then the projects and funding that give effect to those plans, requires systems that support mainstreaming both horizontally and vertically. We also know that this is a very busy space, and there are competing agendas and priorities, both internal to and external to cities. So what can cities do to get this common agenda on the table that then forms the sort of starting point of discussions around where investments are needed to strengthen resilience. What we're doing in South Africa and working with our city governments is the development of integrated resilience-informed city plans and their budgets that put forward the government's priorities for development, and in this case, resilient urban development. And getting these plans on the table has been a starting point for South Africa. And as with many other countries, we are very firmly sort of advocating a need that these projects deliver on a just transition. So through our Presidential Climate Commission, the idea, and not just the idea, but the reality of leaving no one behind in the transition is something that our development trajectory needs to significantly deliver on. We also know that particularly in our country, taking projects into implementation is a recognized weakness. So off the back of the plans, working with partners like the World Bank and SECO to get the support to build capability in the system to take plans into implementation, resulting in the development of capital investments. So what I want to sort of build my contribution here is just to draw out 7 lessons from our experience in South Africa, where we have had some experience in tackling some of the issues that the prior speakers have spoken to. So how do we ensure that resilience starts local? How do we draw on the financing and technical expertise that's available in a way that supports national and local development priorities? So our first lesson, as it were, is something that I spoke to earlier, which is the need to recognize that we've got to transcend the silos, both within city governments and beyond. So we need the institutional structures in place, coordination and collaboration, both formally and formalized and explicit, to enable joined up decision-making and the co-creation of plans and projects for implementation. Support is critical, and I've referenced that, and I think that will come through very clearly in this session, but the partnerships, the expertise, the networks, internal to cities and external to cities, that help to leverage additional resources, expertise, finance, and cooperation across jurisdictions to support the implementation of actions that result in resilience. We need to get implementation at scale, and we need to draw on what's been done elsewhere. We don't need to reinvent the wheel, and we have to get that collaboration. So the institutional mechanisms and structures is critical. Science is a lesson, and the ability to draw on and draw in scientifically robust spatial climate information on city risks. Where in space do these risks occur? What needs to be done about them? We need to map them, and we need to be able to integrate those risks into our city plans and the projects that build off of those plans. And we've drawn on support from the World Bank as well as local national development partners in helping the cities in South Africa get an understanding of where in space their risks form and fall, and what does that mean for the plans that build off of those. From there, it's about looking at what needs to be done. So what are the actions? What are the investments? What are the projects? Some organizations like C40 support the development of adaptation action plans, but fundamentally these actions need to be integrated as projects, as interventions into strategic city plans and into budgets, through from the sectoral plans into the operational expenditure of cities. And that's a process that requires a lot of hard work, integration in the city systems. We also recognize that these investment needs, and it's been referenced today, far exceeds the resource envelopes available. So how do we work together to ensure that we make up that funding gap that Sameh referenced earlier? So we've been working with cities in South Africa to ensure that climate prioritization is integrated into city systems and levers for decision making. So capital project prioritization systems, budgeting systems for infrastructure delivery and maintenance. So these costs do not seem as additional costs and that are incurred, but they're factored into the project development and into the investment decision-making processes. Our sixth lesson is that opportunities for monitoring are critical to understand if the investments are heading us in the right track. So integrating systems into monitoring and evaluation frameworks that exist, but also, and it was mentioned, the opportunities that exist through networks like this for peer learning. How do we draw on the experience that's happened elsewhere? And the World Bank and SECO have provided really phenomenal opportunities to draw on and learn and be inspired by what's happened elsewhere in the world, and what does that mean in our local context. So, you know, this is a social process. And then I think the last point that I want to make, just in closing, is flexibility. I think we see time and time again, and maybe this is a slightly contentious point to end on, but you know, the ability to ensure that the frameworks for support and technical assistance that come from partners around the world responds to what cities want to do at a local level. So the ability to negotiate that space for local development priorities to lead, drawing on the expertise, and how do we adapt and tailor that expertise to enable city-led developments that support urban resilience. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Antea, for your insights on South Africa, you know, especially on the collaboration between cities and national government, but also on how to embed resilience within city systems, budgets, and plans. I'd like now to introduce our fourth panelist, Johnny Babocci. Johnny is an architect and an urban planner. He is the founder of Layer, a platform that enables cities to plan, design, manage, and govern urban environments. He was previously a general director of planning and urban development for the city of Tirana, Albania, and also the director of Atelier Albania, a structure of the Albanian government dealing with national and regional strategic planning. Great to have you with us, Johnny, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sameh, and thank you everyone for organizing this fantastic event. Thanks to the Resilient Cities Network and to the World Bank for having us here talking about these important issues. I especially want to thank the Global Facility for Disaster Recovery and Resilience and the City Resilience Program, with which I have had the privilege to collaborate, for pushing the boundaries in terms of analyzing and also providing a global support network for smaller cities, also for mid-tier cities, to access the data and the knowledge that is out there on resilience. So I want to talk briefly about how can cities make resilience the new normal rather than an added feature. So we often talk about how can we make this project more resilient? I think that's the wrong question to ask. I think we need to build systems in our cities that have that preset, have that as part of the normal day-to-day way of designing and way of building cities. So I'm talking about three aspects of resilience: planning resilience, social resilience, and financial resilience in cities. I want to echo what Dagmar was saying in terms of how can we make smart and resilient urban plans and urban planning. Well, we tried something very modestly in Tirana. The idea was that resilience is to a certain degree about independence, about flexibility, and about disconnectivity, about a system which, despite being organized, a plan, an urban plan, despite being organized at the central level, has ways of expressing itself, of modifying itself at a much more local and a much more high resolution at the neighborhood scale. So how can we incentivize a system of small scale network of changes rather than a big individual large scale important project? So what we did in Tirana through our urban plan was implementing a series of rules and regulations in the development sector, which made the city as a whole more resilient, not just through public intervention, but through all private sector development projects that were happening in the city. For example, we set a minimum percentage of natural filtration for every new build. Every time you wanted to build something new, there was at least 20% of the ground which needed to have natural filtration, so water could percolate directly to the ground and therefore have like a small addition to resilience in terms of flooding at the city scale. We did the same thing, providing incentives for green roofs. So any building in the city which would add a green roof would get a series of tax breaks, and it would contribute in this way, in a very small way, but as a network to improving the city. We had a series of rules and regulations in the plan which incentivized higher buildings with a lower footprint. So we kept the FAR, the building development density norms, the same, but we allowed developers to actually build a bit higher and therefore free more ground at the ground floor of buildings. We also had a fantastic, I would say, project called the Orbital Forest, and the idea was how can we make tree planting fun, interesting, and something that citizens like to engage in? How can the hundreds of thousands of Albanians who move to Tirana literally put roots in the city by planting a tree for a birthday, for a special day in their life, for a loved one who they missed? And how can this become something that, of course, it was a public project. We wanted to plant 2 million trees in 10 years, but how can this become a part of the system of the city of Tirana, rather than something that was always paid or supported by the city? I want to move on to social resilience. We implemented, again, a series of rules which try to change the system, try to change the way that things were happening. For example, since 2018 in Tirana, for every new building, 3% of the square footage of residential area becomes automatic social housing and is passed on to the city. Therefore, every new building that is happening in Tirana is contributing to our social housing stock. We had a severe lack of schools. A lot of schools were working in shifts, coping with the number of pupils because of the huge density and growth that Tirana went through in the past 20 years. Research showed that they were getting a lower standard of education compared to their peers who were studying in the morning. So therefore, there was, after a study that we did, a feasibility study within the city, there was an immediate need for 17 new schools to eliminate this practice of second shifts. And of course, we couldn't afford it. So what we did was we engaged the private sector through a public-private partnership, which was financed by a temporary tax, which was called the cappuccino tax. And the idea was that you would pay a cappuccino a month, and then you would resolve the problem of primary and middle school education for the city of Tirana. We were able to build 17 of those schools, remove this issue. And, I think, in a way, again, it wasn't about building one beautiful school. It was also about how can we redesign the 17 schools as hubs of the community? How can we design them from the ground up to serve after hours as community centers in terms of sports, entertainment, recreation, education. And therefore, they now provide social hubs, not just schools in the morning, but social hubs in the afternoons for different peripheral neighborhoods in Tirana. There's also a very interesting, for example, cultural aspect to this. One interesting example in Tirana is that developers don't purchase the land. They actually enter into contractual agreements with the landowners and compensate them in real estate in every new development in lieu of cash. And therefore, if you're a landowner in Tirana, if you own a small house, you don't actually get bought out. You stay an active part of the community. You never leave. This is not something the city incentivized. This is just something cultural. Developers in the 90s were strapped for cash. So in order to lower their liquidity needs in the beginning, they would just sign these contracts. And now this has become sort of status quo, and it's still how it works in Tirana. Hopefully it will keep working, because in a way it keeps the community in place. It allows families to grow, but at the same time, it allows the city to develop. The last point I want to touch is financial resilience. And again, the concept here is how can we create a virtuous flywheel of development, which gets private sector development and public sector incentives and taxes and sort of connects them together. So we implemented a new infrastructure impact tax for every new development. 8% of the value, not of the cost, but of the actual value of the whole development would be paid in cash to City Hall at the beginning of the development. Now, this allowed us to really increase our capital expenditures at the city while keeping the operating expenditures pretty much the same. By doing this at the same time and by investing in the city through these public projects, the land value was increased, and that meant that there was even more interest in development. So this wheel was basically giving the city more money from every new project before the project even started. So right when it started, we would invest this money back into the city, and this was provide for even more interest in this program. Of course, mixing this with a transferable development rights program, allowing the city to, in a way, move some of the rights around and to basically adjust the land in a very informal, very sort of chaotic city that is the Tirana of the post-90s. I think created this flywheel where the public and the private sector in a way are helping the city move forward and helping the city grow. So I think that at the end, when we talk about how do we align the stakeholders in terms of public initiative, having a public initiative that makes this happen, in my opinion, what worked very well in terms of projects was this idea of, again, how can we create a critical mass project? If you want to build a new corner of the city, a new pole of the city, how can we have the right incentives in terms of higher development for developers, like a big sort of flashy public project, a lot of infrastructure investment in the same spot in the periphery of the city, and have that serve as a nucleus, as a sort of the centerpiece, as a hub of this new neighborhood, and then it will slowly spread by itself in a way as an amoeba and improve that corner of the city. Thank you very much, everyone. I hope that I just shared a very slight slice of what happened in Tirana. I'm very, very happy to discuss with you further.
Thank you so much for making such a focus, but also really colorful description of many really impactful programs that are happening in Tirana. I think what you mentioned about creating the right incentives is so relevant, and what you said without saying in the words you use and the names of your program is you really have to speak to people in a language that they understand and that they're compelled to listen to. Well, speaking of that, our next speaker has a very compelling story to tell, and he is coming to us from Maputo. Silva Magaya is the Superintendent of Territorial Planning, Urbanization, and Environment for the Municipal Council of Maputo. And previous to this, he was the Program Coordinator of the Water and Sanitation for the Urban Poor, and also served as Chairman of the Board of Directors of the Maputo South Development Company. Silva, thank you so much for being here. And for our audience, Silva is our final panelist. So if you have questions, please do remember to put them in the Q&A. Silva, please.
Thank you. First of all, allow me to thank the organizers of this webinar. I was surprised when receiving the invitation, and I'm learning a lot, so I'm the one who have to thank this invitation. In my presentation, I aim to raise attention to the impact of stormwater runoffs in the sustainability and resilience of Maputo as a coastal city. It's a sort of another alert to be considered in our long-term planning process. My presentation will evolve through 3 chapters, namely an introduction, a brief description of the root cause, and closing with remarks. I'm basing my considerations in some historic facts that highlight the level of risk the city lives under. This is the first. I want to share with you that in the beginning of the year 2000, our generation witnessed the first severe landslide in the city when hundreds of dwellings were washed away by stormwater runoffs, and one of the main city roads was cut in 3 sections, and the base soils dragged away towards the lower sides. Then, moving back to history, we had lesson number 2 in 1966. A similar event was recorded in the same geologic formation when a plateau in the south bank of the hill, locally known as Ponta Vermelha, the Anglophones would call this ribbon point, was sliced in 2 halves. You can see that red line in the slide, and the free mass of soils was also dragged down the hill. In the next slide, we can see the average height of the hill as from the sea, around 60 meters, but in some points it will rise up to more than 90 meters. Then we come to lesson number 3. From literature, we learned that far from more than 200 years ago, a similar landslide happened in the eastern bank of the same hill, burying a number of beach stalls located along the boulevard facing the sea. So in this image, you'll see that you are in the same environment. Look at the site on the left corner of this slide. It's the same position I was talking about when mentioning lesson number 2. My point is, what forces cause these historical and so similar landslides in the geographic context of the city? Please note that I'm only sharing few examples, as this is gradually happening in several other places in other cities. This picture is just a 3D model of the past historic of the Maputo city, and it's showing us what happened in lesson number 3. After a number of trials trying to check the options of the force, I considered wind, earthquake, impact forces, or fire. My conclusion was that the acting force, the common acting force in all these events was water. But I would say not alone. And here's where the problem lies. Poor urbanization, along with lack of vision, is causing these cyclic events. Moving to chapter number 2, I will try to explain the reason of this phenomenon. As we grew up knowing that the green belts of Maputo, located in the western and the northeast boundaries of the city, were our main sources of food, as they would supply tons of groceries to the market and even export. You can see in this slide the light green areas were meant for production, and construction of any type of infrastructure was forbidden at that time. Suddenly, during the last 2 decades, there was a strange shift as peasants pretended the soils being no longer fertile and decided hand by hand with the city authority, rendering these areas urbanized. And this is how nowadays Maputo urbanization is taking place. The result is a set of mediocre urban plans, disrespecting core values such as rationality, climate change, and conservation. And what we see is the proliferation of informal and unplanned settlements without regular access roads, lacking adequate drainage and sanitation. And every rainy season, we have to cope with situations like this. During several days, the water is stuck in the byroads and we don't have any means to make it move. In other words, Maputo is growing very quickly by setting poor infrastructure where people should be farming and water should be allowed to soak. Back to the 3 lessons shared in the beginning, it is amazing, but above all shocking, that the latest bigger investment in real estate in the city are taking place precisely in these 3 sites, particularly the former wetland below the Rubin Point I mentioned, so shown in this picture. So this is where the most massive construction is happening in Maputo. If I was an oracle, I would say that the next point to experience a similar landslide will be exactly this point, named as Barreira da Machacane in the east edge of Maputo CBD. This picture is from the early 60s. You can see that it was a forest. This one is from the beginning of this century. You can also see that the place is green. Today, this site hosts several massive investments in buildings for office and commercial use, as you might see in the next slide. In conclusion, the city of Maputo is growing very quickly by building infrastructure in areas where we should be farming or allowing water to soak. The consequences of these options are strong dependency on the importation of food, rendering it too expensive and not affordable for low-income families, a permanent struggle with flash floods and waterborne diseases every rainy season, weakening local economy. And for a country ranked at the bottom of the Human Development Index, this is simply unacceptable and unsustainable. In my opinion, the transformation of cities like Maputo should focus primarily in large-scale stormwater management infrastructure by recovering the former large areas to promote water infiltration. But unfortunately, this has not been the case as we concentrate more on aspects such as road infrastructure, mobility, commercial activities, and the issue of land tenure. We are lucky because albeit this worrying situation, there is still hope as more than 70% of the city is covered by informal settlements, mostly comprised by poor shacks built with non-conventional materials. This offers an opportunity for a fast upgrading program using an approach based on the development of massive social housing projects, promoting medium to high density settlements, so moving from the traditional concept of spreading families horizontally, hence earning space for the construction of extension or artificial basins. Also, a shift from the traditional long-distance resettlement is urgent, and low-income families should be given the option of staying in the vicinity of their original neighborhoods, the so-called in-situ resettlement, hence preserving their social networking and community structure, maintaining the distances between home and school or workplace, and hence ensuring continuity of their livelihoods. Last but not the least, apart from being technical assisted, I think mayors and decision makers need to be equipped with advanced tools to enable them see their cities from an eagle viewpoint from the sky, not horizontally, as the chances of success in urban planning are very limited without a holistic and long-term perspective. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Silva. I mean, very insightful points you've made about urban planning, about nature-based solutions. We got to the section on Q&A. We've got a couple of questions that came. So one of them is about meaningful capacity building programs. How can we implement and build the capacity of local officials? Again, this is something that can just be done through, generic training. It's something that requires much more hands-on engagement. So maybe I can direct this question to both UNDRR and SECO to see how, what is their approach towards strengthening capacity, and then we get to our cities to discuss private sector engagement, which is a recurrent question that came. So maybe Mami and then Dagmar on capacity building.
Thank you, Sameh. So definitely capacity building is one of the cornerstones of building resilience of cities. UNDRR, we have a global education and training institute in Incheon, and since COVID, because of this, we have really increased our reach and depth of our program for capacity building. Just to give you an example, in terms of this capacity building, we have done training courses for how can cities issue bonds, green bonds, resilient bonds. We have also worked with other partners of MCR 2030 to give more detailed explanation of what they are doing, and to build on that. We have been doing a lot of capacity building for cities in order to build their health program, because this is something that was needed in COVID. So this is something that is ongoing. We will expand it. And again, that you are very welcome, all cities, to join. I believe that there again, we do a lot of peer learning too. So that's an important element. And I do believe that it's an area that needs to be more and more scaled up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mami. Dagmar?
Thank you for this question. I would have loved to ask this to the audience, but let me try to explain. I think this is something we have just discussed yesterday and the day before yesterday. And well, when it comes to the definition of capacity development, so there is different aspects. There's the individual aspect, there's the aspect of an institution, and there is the aspect of a society. And there is an aspect of development, of change, it is, and that means, well, how can we support a city in this change, And I think what is most important is really that we have a partner who wants to enter this change process and wants to find out where the gaps for this change are, because we cannot define it. We can support, the analysis and the process, and that's not so easy. I mean, if one would ask me, what is your need for support in change? Well, it would be really difficult to answer this question. And I think it's really to be open and to invest in this process, and also maybe to have more practical hands-on activities, so technical activities, which help then to promote also this change. But I think it is two levels, like really being on the technical level and having this change process in mind and going that path together.
Thanks, Dagmar. The other question that we have, and then I'll hand it over to Lauren, is one on the inclusion of the private sector in urban resilience investment. So maybe we can direct this one to our practitioners on the ground, national and city leaders. So maybe Antea, and then Johnny, and then Silva.
Thank you. I'll lead out on that. I think the first sort of salvo forward in looking at how we can leverage private sector investment in urban resilience, again, is going back to those city plans that I was talking about in my intervention. What plans exist that set out what the city priorities are for their investment, and what are the projects that give effect to those plans? So where are the immediate opportunities for the private sector to come on board and work with city partners to take forward investments that strengthen resilience? And I think, some of the lessons that we've also sort of are sharing through the World Bank with some of the South African cities has been, quite frankly, starting the conversations as early as possible to bring private sector partners into the discussions to understand the city needs, to understand where the opportunities are and where they can best make a contribution that not only addresses resilience, but also looks to build the capacity of the system. That was the subject of the prior conversation. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, echoing what Anthea was saying, I totally agree. I think it's about creating the right system or the right plan that makes it so that the private sector is by default has to be resilient. I think in cities we regulate all sorts of things. There's nothing wrong with regulating resilience as well. It doesn't have to be branded like that, maybe, because that might create in different cities sort of different controversies. But I think it's very, very easy to try and regulate first slowly and then more and more in a bigger fashion. But first slowly with very small interventions, forcing private developers in their private work to sort of be resilient by default because of the way that it's regulated. And then, of course, the collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. And that's, I think, much simpler because there you are the one, the public sector is the one who is sort of drawing the structure of the project. Between them, still, I think that first element of how can we build the right systems and the right plans, as Anthea said, the right structures to actually make resilient the default, I think that's key. And then I just wanted to very, very briefly touch on the capacity building aspect. I think it's key for donors to keep also in mind the political cycles of cities and to try and tackle or build capacity as not something finite, which you do once and then you suppose is there forever, but sort of have it part of projects and have it part of try to get when a city is just sort of moving in, especially in my part of the world, which I think is similar to most of the world. The political cycle is extremely important. The people who are part of the team of city building and working in the city, and typically they tend to have their cycles as well, which often resonate and sort of emulate the political cycle. So they tend to work for the city for 4-8 years and then sort of move on to something else. And I think it's key to try and get as early as possible in those cycles so that you get the most bang for your buck for the support that you're giving.
Thanks. Silva?
Oh, yes, I would share also the particular experience of Maputo City. I think one way to include the private sector should be the creation of incentives for them to adopt resilient practices in their projects. For example, in this particular issue of storm water runoff management, the city of Maputo is considering the possibility of introducing a tax alleviation scheme based on the size of land plots left permeable for the infiltration of water or the inclusion of water retention basins in huge real estate projects, which would help reduce inundations in the city.
Thank you, Silva. This is unfortunately the end of the hour. So I want to take this opportunity to say thank you to all of our panelists for being with us tonight. This was an extremely actionable discussion that we've had tonight. And I think that's the thought that I want to leave this audience with as we begin 2022, that we have done so much mobilization and alignment and conversation. And 2022 for us is really a year of working together and grounding these solutions that we're all talking about. So thank you for starting your 2022 with us on this panel. Thank you, Mami, Dagmar. Thank you to Yoni, to Anthea, and to Silva for being with us tonight. Cities on the Frontline will be here again in 2 weeks' time, as we're continuing with our fortnightly program. The next Cities on the Frontline will be on financing and funding play in cities for resilience with our partners from the Real Play Coalition and Lego. So please do come back in 2 weeks. We look forward to seeing you again. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you all for being there online with us tonight, and good night from Singapore.